Welcome, my friend. Let everything slow. Before he was the Lord of Blasphemy, before he fed himself to a great serpent to live forever, before he turned against the very gods who made him, he was a prince of a royal house, a child of two of the most powerful beings in the lands between. Rykard was born to the Carian Royal Family, the son of a moon queen and a red-haired champion, raised among sorcery and starlight in the lakes of Liurnia. Tonight we begin at his beginning, in the royal house of the full moon, and follow the young prince through the family that shaped him and the abandonment that may have planted the seed of all that came after. Tonight we sit with the birth of the Carian prince, the family of the full moon, and the early life of the one who would become the Lord of Blasphemy. The house of the full moon. Rykard was born into one of the great houses of the lands between, the Carian Royal Family of Liurnia. His mother was Renala, Queen of the Full Moon, the head of the Carian Royal Family, and the leader of the Academy of Raya Lucaria, the great school of sorcery. Renala was a being of immense power and learning, a queen of the moon and the stars, a sorceress whose mastery of the glintstone magics made her one of the most powerful figures in all of Liurnia. The Carian Royal Family ruled the lakes and the Academy from their seat at Carian Manor, a house of sorcery and moonlight, of glintstone and starlight, set among the misty waters of Liurnia. Into this house, this family of the moon, Rykard was born. His father was Radagon, a champion of the Golden Order, a red-haired warrior of immense strength and devotion. Radagon came to Liurnia and wed Renala, the champion of the Erd Tree, joining with the Queen of the Moon, and from their union came children. Radagon was a being of great power in his own right, a warrior and a holy figure of the Golden Order, and his marriage to Renala bound the House of the Moon to the Order of the Erd Tree, the champion and the queen together, for a time, in the misty lakes of Liurnia. There is a deep secret in Radagon that the law reveals only slowly, and it casts a strange light over Rykard's parentage. Radagon, it is said, was in truth the other half of Queen Marika herself, the two of them a single being split into two forms, god and consort sharing one existence. If this is so, then Rykard's father was, in a sense, the goddess herself in another shape, the red-haired champion and the golden queen, one being divided. This would make Rykard's parentage stranger still. The Prince of the Moon, the child of a being who was also the goddess of the Golden Order, his father and his stepmother, one and the same in their deepest nature. The full strangeness of this Rykard may never have known, but it sits beneath his story, a hidden truth in the blood of the Carian prince. Whatever the deepest truth of Radagon, in the days of Rykard's childhood, he was the husband of Renala, the red-haired champion who had wed the Moon Queen and fathered her children. The House of the Full Moon was, for a time, a whole family. The Queen of the Moon, the champion of the Erd Tree, and their 3 children, dwelling together in the misty lakes of Liurnia, in the house of sorcery and starlight. It was into this family, whole and powerful, that Rykard was born, before the abandonment that would break it and the elevation that would remake him. From Renala and Radagon came 3 children, and Rykard was one of them. His brother was Radan, who would grow to become the mightiest of all the demigods, the great general who held back the stars. His sister was Rani, who would become an Empyrean, a candidate to succeed the goddess herself, and who would one day plot the murder that brought down the Golden Age. And Rykard was the third, the prince of the Carian house, raised alongside the future general and the future witch, one of the 3 children of the Moon Queen and the red-haired champion. The family of the full moon was a house of power and promise, and Rykard was born into the heart of it. The house Rykard was born into was steeped in sorcery and the lore of the stars. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, which his mother led, was the greatest school of glintstone sorcery in the lands between, a place of scholars and wizards, of moonlight and starlight and the deep magics of the cosmos. To be a child of Renala was to be raised among this learning, surrounded by the sorceries of the moon, the lore of the stars, the deep and patient magics of the Carian house. Rykard grew up in a world of scholarship and power, a prince of a house whose strength lay in knowledge and sorcery as much as in arms. This upbringing matters for what Rykard became, for it gave him the turn of mind that would later lead him into blasphemy. He was a being of learning as well as power, a prince schooled in the lore of his house, accustomed to seeking out knowledge and turning it to use. The curiosity, the willingness to delve into forbidden and forgotten things, the readiness to take up old and dangerous lore and bend it to his purpose, all of this had its roots in the scholarly house of the moon where he was raised. The Carian prince was a seeker of knowledge from the beginning, and that seeking would one day lead him to the most blasphemous knowledge of all. The abandonment. The happy family of the moon did not endure, for Radagon was called away to a greater destiny, and in being called away, he left his first family behind. When Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, was robbed of his grace and hounded from the lands between, Queen Marika needed a new consort, a new lord to stand at her side, and she chose Radagon. Radagon left Renala, departed the House of the Moon, and returned to the Erdtree capital to become Marika's new husband and the second Elden Lord. The red-haired champion who had wed the Moon Queen abandoned her, leaving Liurnia and his first family behind to take up the highest station in the lands between, the consort of the Eternal Queen, the second Elden Lord. The timing of this is woven into the great turns of the lands between. Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, was cast out of grace and exiled, and his fall left the seat of the consort empty. Into that empty seat came Radagon, called from Liurnia to stand beside the goddess as the second Elden Lord. The abandonment of Renala was bound up with the fall of Godfrey, the one departure following the other, the House of the Moon broken so that Radagon could fill the place the exiled lord had left. Rykard's family was sundered as part of the great machinery of the Golden Order. His father called away to fill a seat emptied by another lord's fall. The abandonment broke Renala. The Queen of the Moon, left by the husband she loved, fell into a deep and lasting grief, a sorrow from which she would never wholly recover. She was left with her children and her academy and her broken heart, the Moon Queen abandoned by the champion she had wed, her family sundered by his departure to a greater destiny. The House of the Full Moon, once whole, was left grieving, the queen broken by the loss of the husband who had gone to stand beside a god. In time, her grief would consume her, leaving her clutching a relic of her lost love, a broken queen in a broken house, the once mighty sorceress undone by the abandonment that had raised her children to godhood. And Rykard, with his siblings, was raised up by this abandonment into something greater and stranger. When Radagon became Marika's consort, his children by Renala became the stepchildren of the goddess, and through that bond they were raised to the status of demigods, beings of more than mortal power. Rykard, Radan, and Rani became demigods, The children of the Moon Queen elevated through their father's union with the goddess, gaining tremendous power even as their family was broken. The abandonment that shattered Renala's heart raised her children to godhood, the Prince of the Moon becoming a demigod through the very departure that broke his mother. There is a strange cruelty in the manner of this elevation. The children did not become demigods through any deed of their own, through any choice or achievement. They became demigods because their father left them, because he went to wed a goddess, because his union with Marika reached back to touch the children he had abandoned. Their power came from the very act that broke their family, their godhood a gift of the abandonment that grieved their mother. To be raised so was to be raised by loss, the children of the moon made divine through the departure that left them fatherless and their mother broken. And the children were moved from the house of their birth into the heart of the order that had taken their father. They left Carian Manor in Liurnia, the seat of the Moon Queen, and went to Leyndell, the royal capital, the heart of the Golden Order and the Erd Tree. The Prince of the Moon was brought into the Golden City, raised among the order his father now served, made a demigod of the very realm that had reached into his family and remade it. Rykard grew from a Carian prince into a demigod of the Golden Order, moved from the misty lakes of his mother's house into the golden heart of the order his father had joined, his life reshaped by the abandonment and the elevation together. The seed of resentment. There is something in this beginning that may have shaped all that Rykard became, a seed of resentment planted in the abandonment and the elevation both. Consider what Rykard's early life taught him. His father left his mother to serve the gods, abandoning the house of the moon for the Erd Tree and the goddess. His mother was broken by that abandonment, left grieving in her academy, and Rykard himself was made a stepchild of the very order that had taken his father away, raised to demigodhood through his father's union with the goddess, rather than through any choice of his own. The Golden Order and its goddess had reached into his family, taken his father, broken his mother, and remade him into a demigod in service of their design. There was much in this for a proud prince to resent. Rykard, the lore suggests, was always a being of strong will and strong opposition, a proud and ambitious figure who chafed against the order of things, and his beginnings gave him much to chafe against. A family broken by the gods, a father lost to the goddess, an elevation that bound him to an order he had not chosen. The seed of his later rebellion may have been planted here, in the house of the moon, in the abandonment that broke his mother, and the elevation that made him a demigod. The proud prince marked from the beginning by the order that had reshaped his family for its own ends. His siblings carried their own marks from the same beginning. Rani, his sister, would come to hate her fate as an Empyrean, the destiny the gods had laid upon her, and would plot to free herself from it through the murder of a god's own son. Radan, his brother, would become the mightiest champion of the very order, the great general who held the line, and Rykard would take a third path, an open and blasphemous rebellion against the gods themselves, set apart from both Radan's submission and Rani's cold scheming. The three children of the moon, raised by abandonment into demigodhood, would each answer their strange beginning in their own way. It is worth marking how different the three siblings became, for it tells us something about Rykard. Radan loved the order, became its greatest champion, held back the very stars to protect the realm. His answer to their strange fate was devotion. Rani hated her destiny but worked in secret, plotting and scheming, her rebellion hidden behind cold patience and careful design. and Rykard's rebellion was the most open and the most blasphemous of the three. Where Radan served and Ranni schemed, Rykard would defy, turning openly against the gods, embracing the blasphemy that the others would never dare, the proud prince who would rise in open rebellion against the order itself, refusing both to submit and to hide. This was the nature the law gives him, a being of immense pride and ambition, a will that would not bend, a prince who chafed against any power above him. Rykard was always a figure of opposition, of strong will and stronger ambition, a demigod who could not accept a place beneath the gods. The abandonment of his father, the breaking of his mother, the elevation that bound him to an order he had not chosen, all fed a pride and a resentment that would one day blossom into the most blasphemous rebellion the lands between had seen. The seed planted in the House of the Moon would grow, in time, into the Lord of Blasphemy. We should hold one thing in mind as we leave his beginnings, for it shapes everything that follows. Rykard's rebellion, blasphemous and terrible as it would become, grew from a place that any heart can understand. He had seen his family broken by the gods, his father taken, his mother destroyed, himself remade into a piece of an order he had not chosen. From this came a question that would drive him for the rest of his existence. Why should anyone live beneath the will of the gods? Why should the greater will, the golden order, the Erdtree, hold dominion over all things, breaking families and binding lives to their design? The proud Prince of the Moon would come to answer that question with rebellion. But the question itself was born here, in the broken house of his childhood, in the abandonment that taught him to resent the gods. And so we leave the Carian prince at the threshold of his story, born to a house of moon and sorcery, raised by abandonment into demigodhood, carrying within him the pride and the resentment that would one day make him the Lord of Blasphemy. He was not yet the serpent, not yet the devourer of gods, not yet the blasphemer reviled by all. He was a proud prince with a wounded heart and an unbending will, a demigod who could not accept a master, a seeker of knowledge raised in a house of sorcery. All that he would become waited ahead of him, but its roots were here, in the house of the full moon, and the abandonment that broke it. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the Justiciar of the Golden Order. The Inquisitor Lord Rykard was before he turned against the gods. Before Rykard became the blasphemer, before he turned against the gods, he served them. He was a Justiciar of the Golden Order, a Lord of Law and Judgment, commanding a company of Inquisitors who hunted the enemies of the Erdtree. There is a deep irony in this, that the one who would become the Lord of Blasphemy began as an enforcer of the very order he would come to despise. Tonight we sit with Rykard the Justiciar, the ruthless Lord of Law he was before his fall, and the cruelty that ran through his service even in the days when he still served the gods. Tonight we sit with the Justiciar of the Golden Order. The Inquisitor Lord Rykard was before he turned to blasphemy. The Lord of Judgment. In the days of the Golden Order, before his blasphemy, Rykard held a high and terrible office. He was a Justiciar. A Justiciar is a Lord of Law and Judgment, an enforcer of the Order's will, charged with rooting out and punishing those who transgressed against the Erdtree. Rykard held this office, and held it with terrible severity. He was a ruthless Justiciar, the law tells us, a Lord of Judgment reviled for the cruelty of his rule, a demigod who wielded the law of the Golden Order as a weapon against its enemies. Where another might have tempered judgment with mercy, Rykard was known for his ruthlessness, the severity of his rule, the cold, hard justice he dealt to those who fell under his authority. To carry out his judgments, Rykard commanded a company of inquisitors. These were his agents, the enforcers of his will, the hunters who sought out the enemies of the Golden Order and brought them to Rykard's terrible justice. The inquisitors of Rykard were feared, a company of hunters who served the ruthless Justiciar, carrying out his persecutions across the lands under his authority. With this company at his command, Rykard was a power of law and punishment in the Golden Order, the Lord of Judgment whose inquisitors hunted the Order's enemies and whose justice was a thing to be feared. The targets of his judgment were those deemed heretics and enemies of the Erdtree. Among them were the Albinorics, an artificial people created by sorcery, a folk despised and persecuted by the Golden Order. Rykard's inquisitors hunted such people. The Albinorics and others marked as enemies of the Order, persecuting and tormenting those whom the Golden Order condemned. The Justiciar's justice fell hard upon the despised and the heretical, the persecuted peoples of the lands between, the enemies of the Erdtree, who came under the cold judgment of the ruthless Lord and his inquisitors. The Golden Order was an order of strict hierarchy and harsh judgment, and it had many enemies, many peoples and beliefs it condemned. Those who worshipped outside its bounds, those born outside its blessing, those whose very existence offended its design, all fell under the Order's condemnation, and many fell under Rykard's authority. The Justiciar was the Order's hand of judgment, the Lord who carried its harsh law to those it condemned, the demigod whose inquisitors enforced the Golden Order's will upon the despised and the heretical. To serve as a Justiciar was to be the Order's instrument of persecution, and Rykard served in this office with a severity that made him feared. There is something fitting, in a dark way, that Rykard held this office. A being of pride and severity, of strong will and ruthless nature, he was suited to the work of judgment and punishment. The Order found in him an instrument of its harsh law, a lord whose nature matched the severity of the office, a Justiciar whose ruthlessness served the Order's will. Rykard the Justiciar was the Golden Order's cruelty given form, the harsh judgment of the Erdtree carried out by a demigod whose own nature was hard and proud and severe, the Lord of Judgment well suited to the terrible office he held. The cruelty of the Justiciar. There is a darkness in Rykard's service that the Lord does not hide, a cruelty that ran through his rule even when he stood as a Lord of the Golden Order. Rykard was not merely strict in his judgments. He was cruel, given to torment, a lord who took his persecutions beyond the cold demands of law into something darker. His inquisitors did not only punish the enemies of the Order, they tortured them, tormented them, mercilessly afflicting those who fell into their hands. The Justiciar's justice was a thing of cruelty as well as severity. The ruthless lord and his inquisitors dealing torment as well as punishment to the despised and the condemned. There was a streak of cruelty in Rykard from the beginning, a darkness in his nature that his service to the Order gave room to grow. This cruelty would mark him for the rest of his existence, long after he turned from the Order he once served. The torture devices, the instruments of torment, the cold pleasure in the suffering of others, these were not things Rykard acquired when he became the blasphemer. They were in him from his days as a Justiciar. The cruelty of the Lord of Judgment carried forward into the cruelty of the Lord of Blasphemy. The man who would one day build chambers of torment beneath his manor was already, in his days of service, a lord who tormented those who fell under his authority. It is worth marking this, for it complicates the figure of Rykard. He is, in some ways, a rebel against an unjust order, a demigod who turned against the tyranny of the gods. But he was also, from the beginning, a cruel and ruthless being. a lord who tormented the weak and the despised even in service of the order he would later condemn. His rebellion was the defiance of a being who was always proud, always ruthless, always capable of great cruelty, rather than the rebellion of a gentle soul driven to defiance. The Justiciar's cruelty is part of who Rykard was, a darkness that ran through him from his service to the order, to his blasphemy against it. This makes Rykard a difficult figure to judge, and that difficulty is part of what makes him interesting. His cause, in some lights, has merit. The Golden Order was harsh and cruel, the rule of the gods a tyranny over the lives of the lands between, and a rebellion against it might be called just. But Rykard himself was no gentle liberator, no noble rebel fighting for the oppressed. He was a cruel lord who tormented the weak, a ruthless justiciar who persecuted the despised, a being whose own nature was as harsh as the order he served. His rebellion against tyranny was the rebellion of a tyrant, his defiance of cruelty, the defiance of a cruel being. And this tension runs through the whole of his story. Rykard's ideas, his rejection of the gods, his refusal to accept the rule of the greater will, carry a certain force, a question worth asking about the right of gods to rule the lives of others. But his methods, his cruelty, his torments, his devouring of the living are monstrous. He is a being whose cause might be defended and whose deeds cannot. A rebel with a point and a tyrant with a torture chamber. The blasphemer whose defiance of the gods is bound up with a cruelty all his own. The Justiciar's cruelty is where this tension begins. The darkness in Rykard that would run alongside his rebellion to the very end. The Iron Virgins. Among the works of Rykard the Justiciar were terrible machines, automatons built for carnage and for the taking of victims. Rykard was known for the construction of the Iron Virgins, automatons of his own design. These were machines capable of battlefield carnage, war engines that could tear through the enemies of their master. But they served another purpose as well, a darker one. The Iron Virgins were also built to abduct victims, to seize the living and carry them away, transporting them to Rykard's manor for purposes of his own. The Justiciar built machines that were both weapons of war and instruments of abduction, the Iron Virgins serving to slay his enemies and to capture the victims he required. The abduction of victims points toward the darkness that was growing in Rykard even in his days of service. He required living victims, seized and carried to his manor, for purposes the law reveals only in their terrible fullness later. The Iron Virgins were the instruments of this requirement, the machines that brought him the living, the automatons that fed the dark designs taking shape in the mind of the Justiciar. Even as a lord of the Golden Order, Rykard was building the machinery of something darker, the Iron Virgins carrying their captives to the manor, where his blasphemy would one day take root. These machines are a mark of the kind of being Rykard was, inventive, ruthless, willing to build terrible things in service of his designs. He was a maker as well as a judge, a demigod who constructed engines of carnage and abduction to serve his will. The Iron Virgins are an early sign of the Rykard, who would one day build chambers of torment and feed living victims to a great serpent. The inventive cruelty of the Justiciar already at work in the machines that slew his enemies and seized his victims. The Lord of Judgment was, even then, a builder of terrible things. The name itself, the Iron Virgins, carries a grim echo of old instruments of torture, the Iron Maidens of ancient cruelty, and the echo is fitting. Rykard's machines were instruments of suffering as much as weapons of war, engines built to seize and to torment as well as to slay. The The Justiciar who tortured his prisoners built machines that embodied the same cruelty. The Iron Virgins carrying forward into iron and engine the torment that Rykard dealt to those who fell under his power. Even his works of craft were works of cruelty. The maker's hand and the tormentor's heart joined in the terrible machines. And these machines served the dark designs that were taking shape in Rykard's mind. Designs that needed a steady supply of the living. The victims the Iron Virgins seized were carried to the Volcano Manor, Rykard's seat on Mount Gelmir, for purposes that would become clear only in their full horror later. The Justiciar was gathering victims, building the machinery of abduction, preparing for something whose nature he kept hidden. The Iron Virgins were the first engines of a design that would grow into the horror of the Volcano Manor. The abducting machines feeding the dark purpose of a lord who was already, beneath his service to the Order, becoming something monstrous. The servant who would rebel. There is a great irony at the heart of Rykard's early life, and it is worth sitting with before we follow him into blasphemy. Rykard, who would become the Lord of Blasphemy, the great rebel against the gods, began as a servant of the very order he would come to despise. He was a justiciar of the Golden Order, an enforcer of its law, a hunter of its enemies. He persecuted those the Order condemned, tormented those it despised, served the Erdtree as a lord of judgment and cruelty. The one who would one day seek to devour the gods themselves spent his early existence enforcing their will. The future blasphemer, a faithful and ruthless servant of the Order he would later turn against. What turned him from servant to rebel is the question that drives the rest of his story. Something changed in Rykard, some knowledge gained, some truth understood, some resentment grown too great to bear, that turned the Justiciar of the Golden Order into its greatest blasphemer. The proud prince who had always chafed against the gods, who carried the resentment of his broken family, who served the Order with cruelty but perhaps without love, would find a reason and a means to turn against it. The servant would become the rebel, the Justiciar the blasphemer, the enforcer of the Order its enemy, and the turn, when it came, would be total. Rykard would not merely abandon the Golden Order. He would set himself against it utterly, against the Erdtree, against the gods, against the very powers that ruled the lands between. The Justiciar, who had hunted heretics, would become the greatest heretic of all, the Lord of Judgment, the Lord of Blasphemy, the servant of the gods, the one who sought to devour them. What began this turn? What knowledge and what choice set the proud Justiciar on the road of blasphemy is the story we follow next. There is a pattern here that runs through many of the great rebels of the lands between, and Rykard fits it in his own way. Those who turn most fiercely against an order are often those who once served it most closely, who knew it from within, who saw its workings and its cruelties up close. Rykard had been the Order's instrument, had carried out its harsh judgments, had enforced its will upon the despised. He knew the Golden Order as only a servant could know it, and perhaps that knowledge, that closeness, was part of what turned him against it. The Justiciar who had served the Order's cruelty may have come to see it for what it was, and in seeing, to turn against it. For now, at the close of his days of service, Rykard stands as a figure of dark irony, the future blasphemer in the robes of a Justiciar, the rebel against the gods enforcing their will, the devourer of the Order serving it as a lord of judgment. He has the pride that will fuel his rebellion, the cruelty that will mark his blasphemy, the inventive ruthlessness that will build his terrible works. All that he lacks is the knowledge and the means to turn against the gods, and these he will find on a burning mountain, in the law of a forgotten serpent. The servant is ready to become the rebel. He needs only the spark, and the spark waits for him on Mount Gelmir. Tomorrow, we climb Mount Gelmir with Rykard, to the volcano where he found the forbidden law that would begin his fall. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we climb to Mount Gelmir, to the ancient serpent law Rykard found in the fire of the mountain. There is a volcano in the west of the Altus Plateau, a mountain of fire and ash called Mount Gelmir, and it was here that Rykard's fall began. On this burning mountain, the Justiciar of the Golden Order found the relics of a forgotten people, a cult that had worshipped a serpent and practiced hexes of magma, a religion the Golden Order had condemned as blasphemy. In delving into this forbidden law, Rykard set his feet on the road that would lead him to the serpent, to blasphemy, and to the devouring of the gods. Tonight we climb Mount Gelmir and sit with the discovery that began the making of the Lord of Blasphemy. Tonight we sit with the mountain of fire, the forgotten serpent cult, and the forbidden law that began Rykard's fall. The mountain of fire. Mount Gelmir is a place apart, a volcano of fire and ruin in the western reaches of the realm of the Erd Tree. The mountain lies in the west of the Altus Plateau, the high realm where the Erd Tree stands at the heart of the Golden Order. But Mount Gelmir is no part of the golden serenity of that realm. It is a volcano, a mountain of fire and magma, of ash and ruin, a broken and burning place set against the order of the Erd Tree, where the Altus Plateau is the realm of gold and grace. Mount Gelmir is a place of fire and shadow, a volcanic wound in the high country, a mountain whose nature is fire and destruction rather than gold and order. It was on this mountain that Rykard made his seat, the Volcano Manor that would become his domain. Whether he came to the mountain drawn by its fire, by the law hidden within it, or by some other purpose, the burning mountain became his home, the volcanic seat of the Justiciar, who would become the Lord of Blasphemy. Mount Gelmir, the mountain of fire, the place apart from the Golden Realm, became the domain of Rykard, the seat from which his blasphemy would grow. There is a fittingness in this, that Rykard's fall should begin on a volcano. The mountain of fire stands against the gold of the Erd Tree, a place of heat and ruin in a realm of grace and order, a wound of fire in the golden country. And Rykard, the rebel against the Golden Order, would make this burning place his home, the volcano matching the fire of his own rebellion, the mountain of ruin suiting the Lord who would seek to bring ruin to the gods. The fire of Mount Gelmir and the fire of Rykard's blasphemy belong together, the volcanic mountain the fitting birthplace of the Lord of Blasphemy. The mountain would become the site of terrible things in the years to come. During the shattering, when the demigods warred over the broken Elden Ring, Mount Gelmir would be the stage of one of the most appalling battles in all that long war, a place of fire and slaughter and horror. The volcano that Rykard made his home would become a byword for the worst the shattering could produce, the burning mountain the setting of atrocities that even that terrible war would mark as among its darkest. Mount Gelmir was a place of fire and ruin, and under Rykard, it would become a place of blasphemy and horror as well. For now, though, in the days of Rykard's discovery, the mountain was a place of fire and forgotten law, a volcanic seat for the demigod who had come to dwell there. He made the Volcano Manor his domain, the burning mountain his home, and in its fire and its relics he found the things that would make him the Lord of Blasphemy. The mountain of fire set apart from the Golden Realm, became the cradle of Rykard's fall, the volcanic seat where the proud demigod found the forbidden law and the immortal serpent that would reshape him. On Mount Gelmir, the Justiciar began his turn into the blasphemer, the fire of the mountain lighting the road of his rebellion. Chor, the forgotten cult. On Mount Gelmir, Rykard found the relics of a people long vanished, a cult that had worshipped something the Golden Order could not abide. In ancient times, before the reign of the Golden Order had settled over the mountain, a cult had dwelt on Mount Gelmir, a people who practiced hexes drawn from the magma of the volcano and who worshipped a serpent as their god. They performed their rites in reverence to this serpent deity, offering up sacrifices, working their magma hexes, practicing a religion bound to the fire of the mountain and the great serpent they revered. This was the cult of Gelmir, a forgotten people of fire and serpent worship, vanished into the past, their religion lost, their rites abandoned, their law left to lie dormant in the burning mountain. The religion of this cult was blasphemy in the eyes of the Golden Order, and for a particular reason, the serpent. In the symbolism of the Golden Order, the serpent is a traitor to the Erd Tree, a creature of defiance and blasphemy, the enemy of the Golden Tree. To worship a serpent was to worship the very symbol of treason against the Erd Tree, to revere the creature that stood against the Golden Order's god. The serpent cult of Mount Gelmir was thus blasphemy of the deepest kind, a religion that worshipped the symbol of treason against the very order that ruled the lands between. Over time, the cult had vanished, their practices ceased, their magma sorceries lost. The forgotten people of Mount Gelmir passed into the past, leaving behind only relics, only the dormant lore of their religion, only the traces of their serpent worship and their hexes of fire. The mountain held the memory of them, the relics of their cult, the lost sorceries of magma, the dormant lore of the serpent they had revered. And there this forgotten blasphemy lay, waiting in the burning mountain, until a demigod with a wounded heart and an unbending will came seeking, and found it. It is worth pausing on what this cult represented, for it stood against everything the Golden Order was. The Golden Order was an order of light and gold, of the Erd Tree and the greater will, of hierarchy and law, and the rule of the gods. And the serpent cult of Mount Gelmir was its opposite in every way, a religion of fire rather than gold, of the serpent rather than the tree, of magma and sacrifice rather than grace and order. To the Golden Order, this was blasphemy of the deepest kind, a religion that revered the very symbol of treason against the Erd Tree, a worship of fire and serpent that stood against everything the Order held holy. And the rites of this cult were dark ones. They performed human sacrifices in reverence to their serpent god, offering up the living to the creature they worshipped, working their magma hexes through blood and fire. This was a religion of sacrifice and fire, of the serpent fed with the lives of the offered, a dark and bloody worship that the Golden Order had cause to condemn beyond its blasphemy alone. The law Rykard found on Mount Gelmir was thus a law of sacrifice as well as serpent worship, a dark religion of feeding the serpent with the living, and in taking it up, Rykard took up its darkness along with its power. The Forbidden Law. Rykard discovered the relics of the forgotten cult, and rather than leaving the blasphemy buried, he took it up and brought it back to life. After discovering the ancient hexes of Gelmir, the lost sorceries of the forgotten serpent cult, Rykard brought them back into practical use as new forms of sorcery. The magma hexes that had lain dormant since the cult vanished were revived by the demigod, restored to use. made into new sorceries of fire and magma. The lost lore of the blasphemous cult, forgotten and abandoned, was brought back to life by Rykard, the Justiciar of the Golden Order, reviving the very blasphemy his order condemned. He took the forbidden knowledge, the lore of fire and serpent, and made it his own. This was a choice of deep significance, and it marks a turn in Rykard's story. He was a Justiciar of the Golden Order, a hunter of heretics, an enforcer of the Order's law. And here he found the law of a blasphemous cult, a religion the Order condemned, the worship of the serpent that was treason against the Erdtree. He might have left it buried, destroyed it, condemned it as his office demanded. Instead, he took it up, revived it, made the forbidden law his own. The hunter of heretics embraced the heresy. The enforcer of the Order took up the blasphemy it condemned. The Justiciar began his turn toward becoming the Lord of Blasphemy. There is a hunger in this act, a reaching for power and knowledge that the Order forbade. Rykard, the proud demigod who chafed against the gods, found on Mount Gelmir a lore of power, a forbidden knowledge, a blasphemy he could turn to his own ends. And he reached for it, took it up, made it his own, the seeker of knowledge from the House of the Moon, delving into the most forbidden lore he could find. The discovery of the Gelmir hexes was the first step of his open turn. The proud prince reaching for the forbidden power that would feed his rebellion against the gods. The magma sorceries Rykard revived became a power of his own. Weapons of fire drawn from the heart of the volcano. He brought the lost hexes back into practical use, made them into new sorceries, mastered the fire of the mountain as the vanished cult once had. The Lord of Mount Gelmir became a master of magma and fire, wielding the revived sorceries of the forgotten cult, the forbidden law made into the power of the demigod who had reclaimed it. Where the cult had worked their hexes in reverence to their serpent god, Rykard worked them in service of his own ambition. The fire of the mountain turned to the purposes of the proud demigod. And in reviving this law, Rykard bound himself ever closer to the blasphemy he would embrace. Each step deeper into the forbidden knowledge, each magma hex revived, each fragment of the serpent cult's law reclaimed, drew him further from the Golden Order and closer to the serpent. The Justiciar, who had hunted heretics, was becoming a master of heresy, the enforcer of the Order steeping himself in the very blasphemy it condemned, the forbidden law of Mount. Gelmir was the road by which Rykard travelled from servant to rebel, from Justiciar to blasphemer, each revived hex a step further down the road that would end in the maw of the great serpent, the serpent in the mountain. The deepest thing Rykard found on Mount Gelmir was a living horror rather than a sorcery or a relic, the great serpent of the burning mountain. For the mountain held more than the law of the vanished cult. It held the serpent itself, or a serpent of its kind, the great serpent of Mount Gelmir, an ancient and immortal horror that had dwelt in the fire of the mountain since primeval times. This was the God-Devouring Serpent, an elder serpent of insatiable hunger, a creature that had existed without aging since the oldest days, a being of endless gluttony that sought to devour all it could. The serpent the cult had worshipped, or one of its terrible kind, dwelt still in the burning mountain, waiting in the fire and the dark. The serpent was a thing of terrible hunger, hated for its insatiable gluttony, an immortal terror that the law says sought one day to consume the entire world. It had existed since primeval times, unaging, endless, a creature of pure devouring hunger dwelling in the fire of the mountain. For ages it had been held back, repelled by an ancient weapon of light, the serpent hunter's power that had kept the great serpent at bay since the oldest days. But the serpent endured, immortal and hungering, waiting in the burning mountain for the day it might devour and grow without end. And Rykard found it. The demigod who had revived the blasphemous law of the serpent cult found the serpent itself, the great immortal horror of the mountain, the God-Devouring Serpent of endless hunger. What he saw in it, what desire it woke in him, is the heart of his fall. For in the immortal serpent, Rykard would come to see the answer to his deepest longing, a way to live forever, to grow without end, to devour even the gods. The discovery of the serpent was the discovery of the thing that would make him the Lord of Blasphemy, the immortal horror in the burning mountain that the proud demigod would one day give himself to. What he chose to do with that discovery is the turn we follow next. Consider what the serpent offered to a being like Rykard. He was a demigod, proud and ambitious, who could not accept a place beneath the gods, who hungered for power and chafed against the order that ruled the lands between. And here was a creature of endless hunger and endless life, an immortal that grew by devouring, a being that could consume without limit and live without end. In the serpent, Rykard saw a power to be seized, rather than a horror to be destroyed, a path to the immortality and the strength he craved, a way to grow beyond even the gods. The thing the Golden Order would have called a monster, Rykard saw as an answer. This is the moment his fall took its shape, though the final step was yet to come. The proud demigod, the reviver of forbidden law, looked upon the immortal serpent and saw in it the fulfillment of his deepest desire, to live forever, to grow without end, to devour the very gods who had broken his family and bound his life. All of this the serpent seemed to offer. Rykard had found, in the burning mountain, the thing he had been seeking without knowing it, the answer to his pride and his hunger and his rebellion. The discovery of the God-Devouring Serpent was the discovery of his own dark destiny, the immortal horror that the Lord of Blasphemy would make himself one with. Tomorrow we sit with the turn to blasphemy, the choice that set Rykard against the gods themselves. Sleep well. Tomorrow we follow Rykard's turn to blasphemy, the reasons for his rebellion and the dark plot he joined against the gods. We have seen Rykard born into a broken family, serving the Golden Order as a ruthless Justiciar, and finding on Mount Gelmir the forbidden law and the immortal serpent that would reshape him. Tonight we come to the turn itself, the moment Rykard set himself against the gods. We will sit with the reasons for his rebellion, the woman who stood at his side, and the dark plot he joined to gain the power to kill the gods themselves. For Rykard's blasphemy was not a sudden madness. It was a rebellion with a cause, a defiance with a purpose, and tonight we sit with what that cause and that purpose were. Tonight we sit with the turn to blasphemy, the reasons for Rykard's rebellion, and the dark plot he joined against the gods. The cause of the rebel. Rykard's rebellion was not a mindless thing. It had a cause, a set of beliefs that turned the Justiciar against the order he served. Rykard came to reject the rule of the gods over the lands between, the dominion of the Golden Order, and the Erd Tree over all things. He came to believe that no one should have to live under the will of the gods, that the rule of the greater will and its order was a tyranny that should be thrown down. The proud demigod, who had always chafed against the powers above him, hardened that chafing into a creed, a rejection of the Golden Order, a defiance of the Erd Tree, a refusal to accept that the gods had any right to rule the lives of the lands between. His rebellion was a rebellion of belief, a turning against the very idea that the gods should hold dominion. His defiance reached past the Golden Order to the powers behind it. Rykard set himself against the Two Fingers, the messengers of the greater will, the voices through which the distant god of the Golden Order made its will known. He rejected the guidance of the Fingers, the dogma they preached, the grace they offered, seeing in them only the instruments of a tyranny he refused to serve. Where others accepted the burden of the god's grace and heeded the words of the Fingers, Rykard turned against them all, against the Erd Tree, against the greater will, against the Two Fingers that spoke for it. His was a rebellion against the whole order of the heavens. There was a particular grievance at the heart of his defiance, born of the war that had broken the lands between. Rykard came to believe that the Two Fingers, the messengers of the greater will, had set the demigods against one another, had made the children of Marika fight and die in the shattering for the shards of the Elden ring. The gods and their fingers, in his eyes, had made the demigods and the Tarnished kill one another, while they themselves did nothing, manipulating their creations into endless war. Rykard could not forgive this, the gods who set their children fighting and stood aloof from the slaughter, and his rebellion was in part an answer to it, a refusal to be a pawn in the games of the gods. There is a force to this grievance that is worth acknowledging, for it gives Rykard's rebellion a real moral weight. The shattering was a war of the demigods, brother against brother, the children of Marika tearing the realm apart, over the shards of the broken ring. And if, as Rykard believed, this war was the design of the greater will and its Fingers, set in motion to serve the distant god's purposes, then the demigods were pawns, their suffering a thing arranged by powers that cared nothing for them. To rebel against such gods, to refuse to be a piece in their game, to seek the power to throw them down, is a defiance one can understand, even sympathize with. Rykard's cause, in this light, is the cause of the used against those who use them. This is what makes Rykard more than a simple villain, and his story more than a tale of a monster. His rebellion has a point, a grievance with real force. The gods who rule the lands between are distant, manipulative powers who set their own children to slaughter, and a being who refused to accept their rule might be called something other than a villain. Rykard saw a tyranny and refused to bow to it, saw his kin used as pawns and refused to be one, saw the games of the gods and resolved to end them. Whatever the horror of what he became, the cause that drove him carries a weight that the law does not dismiss, the rebel against the gods with a grievance that deserves to be heard. The Lady Tanith. Rykard did not turn to blasphemy alone. At his side stood a woman who would share his rebellion to the very end and beyond, the Lady Tanith. Long ago, when Rykard first set eyes on Tanith, she was working as a dancer in a foreign land, a distant country far from the lands between. Rykard encountered her there, and something in her drew him, for soon he made her his consort, raising the dancer of a foreign land to be the lady of the Volcano Manor. Tanith left her old life and joined Rykard, becoming his partner and his consort, the woman who would stand at his side through all his rebellion against the gods. Tanith shared Rykard's cause, his defiance of the Erd Tree and the Fingers. She became the voice of his rebellion, calling others to rise against the Golden Order, to refuse the burden of the god's grace, to turn against the Erd Tree and the dogma of the Fingers. The lady of the Volcano Manor preached her Lord's creed, gathering others to the cause of rebellion, calling on them to rise against the gods rather than submit to their rule. Tanith was the herald of Rykard's blasphemy, the voice that called others to join his war against the heavens, and her devotion to Rykard ran deeper than any cause. When Rykard set himself on the road of blasphemy, when he prepared to do the terrible thing that would make him the Lord of Blasphemy, he offered Tanith a way out, a tonic that would purge her memories of him, sparing her the grief of what he was about to become. But she refused. There could be no greater distress, she told him, than to forget him. Tanith chose to remember, to stay, to share whatever fate her lord embraced, her love for him greater than any horror he might become. She would be the only human to remain at his side through all that followed, the consort whose devotion outlasted even his transformation into a monster. There is something both tender and terrible in this devotion. Tanith loved Rykard without reserve, enough to refuse the mercy of forgetting, enough to stay at his side as he became a monster, enough to share a fate that any sane being would flee. When he became the serpent of blasphemy, when his form was swallowed by the great horror of the mountain, she remained, the one human who would not leave him. In that moment, the Lord tells us, she was charmed by him, her love deepening rather than recoiling, as he became the thing he became. Her devotion is a strange and dark light in his story, a love that held even through transformation into horror, and her loyalty would outlast even his fall. After Rykard gave himself to the serpent, Tanith would continue his work, leading his followers, gathering others to his cause, carrying on the rebellion her lord had begun. She would remain the lady of the Volcano Manor, the voice of Rykard's blasphemy, the keeper of his cause long after he had become the serpent. Tanith's devotion was the constant of Rykard's story, the love that did not waver, the consort who stayed through cause and conspiracy and transformation, the one human who remained at the side of the Lord of Blasphemy through everything he became. The Night of the Black Knives. Rykard's rebellion was not only a matter of belief, it was also a plot, and he joined one of the darkest conspiracies in the history of the lands between. Rykard was one of the plotters of the Night of the Black Knives, the dark conspiracy in which his sister Ranni arranged the murder of Godwyn the Golden. Ranni, seeking to free herself from her fate as an Empyrean, plotted the killing of the god's own son, the slaying of Godwyn's soul with a fragment of the rune of death. And Rykard was part of this plot, one of the conspirators in the dire deed that would shatter the Golden Age. The Justiciar turned rebel joined his sister's conspiracy, lending himself to the murder that would bring down the Golden Order's peace. For his part in the plot, Ranni rewarded Rykard with a dark gift. On the night of the dire deed, she gave him traces of the rune of death, engraved upon a slab of stone, a relic that could deflect the power of the black blade. This was the blasphemous claw, a weapon born of the rune of death, given to Rykard for a purpose that reached far beyond the murder of Godwyn. The traces of death were a tool for a future trespass, a weapon held in reserve for a deed Rykard meant to do in time. The purpose of this gift reveals the depth of Rykard's ambition. The traces of the rune of death would allow Rykard to challenge Malekith, the Black Blade, the beast who guarded destined death itself. Rykard meant, one day, to face Malekith and seize the rune of death, the power that could kill even the gods. For the rune of death is the one power that can bring true death to the immortal, the only thing that can slay a god. And Rykard wanted it, meant to take it, planned to wield the power of death against the very gods he had come to despise. His rebellion aimed at nothing less than the power to kill the gods. The traces of death, a first step towards seizing the weapon, that could end even the immortal. This is the scale of Rykard's ambition, and it sets him apart even among the rebels of the lands between. He did not merely wish to escape the gods, or to defy them, or to throw off their rule. He wished to kill them, to gain the one power that could bring death to the immortal, to seize destined death itself, and turn it against the gods who had used him and his kin. Where his sister Ranni sought to free herself from the gods, Rykard sought to destroy them, his ambition reaching past escape to the very slaying of the divine. The traces of death that Ranni gave him were the seed of this ambition, the first fragment of the power he meant to wield against the heavens. And the Night of the Black Knives bound Rykard into the great conspiracy that brought down the Golden Age. The murder of Godwyn, the slaying of his soul with the stolen fragment of death, was the deed that drove Marika to shatter the Elden Ring, the first blow in the fall of the Golden Order. Rykard was part of this, one of the plotters whose conspiracy began the end of the Golden Age. The rebel against the gods lent himself to the murder that shattered their order, his part in the dire deed binding him into the dark history of the lands between, the Justiciar turned conspirator, helping to bring down the very order he had once served. The Road of Blasphemy. All of these threads, the cause, the consort, the plot, came together on the road that Rykard now walked, the Road of Blasphemy. Rykard had become something the Golden Order could not abide, a demigod who rejected the gods, who defied the Erdtree and the Fingers, who plotted against the Order and sought the power to kill the gods themselves. He had a cause, the rejection of the gods' tyranny. He had a consort, Tanith, who shared his defiance. He had a plot, his part in the Night of the Black Knives and the traces of death it won him. And he had a goal, the power to slay the gods, to throw down the rule of the heavens, to free the lands between from the dominion of the greater will. The Justiciar had become the rebel, the servant, the blasphemer. His own words capture the spirit of the road he walked. The road of blasphemy, he understood, was long and perilous, and one could not walk it unprepared to sin. Rykard knew what he was doing, knew the darkness of the road he had chosen, knew that to defy the gods and seek the power to kill them was a sin of the deepest kind. And he embraced it, prepared himself to sin, set his feet on the long and perilous road of blasphemy with open eyes. He would not turn back from the darkness his rebellion demanded. He would walk the road of blasphemy to its end, whatever it required of him. There is a clarity in this that sets Rykard apart from those who fall to darkness without knowing it. He did not stumble into blasphemy, did not become a monster without meaning to, did not lose himself by accident. He chose his road with open eyes, understood it as blasphemy and sin, and walked it anyway, prepared for whatever it demanded. Rykard's fall was a thing he embraced, a road he chose knowing its darkness, a sin he committed with full understanding. This is part of what makes him such a striking figure, the rebel who knew full well what he was becoming and became it on purpose, the blasphemer who walked his road with open eyes, and the end of that road was the serpent. For all his cause and his plotting, Rykard came to believe that to defy the gods in full, to gain the power to devour them, to live forever and grow without end, he would have to do the most blasphemous thing of all. He would have to give himself to the great serpent, to become one with the immortal horror of the mountain, to trade his own form for the endless hunger and endless life of the God-Devouring Serpent. The road of blasphemy led to the maw of the serpent, and Rykard, prepared to sin, would walk into it. What he did when he gave himself to the serpent is the turn we follow next. Tomorrow we sit with the feeding to the serpent, the moment Rykard became the Lord of Blasphemy. Sleep well. Tomorrow, we follow Rykard into the maw of the Great Serpent and the terrible bargain that made him immortal. Tonight, we come to the deed that gives Rykard his name, the most blasphemous act of his whole story. He fed himself to the Great Serpent, the proud demigod, the rebel against the gods, walked willingly into the maw of the immortal horror of Mount Gelmir, giving up his own form to become one with the God-Devouring Serpent. In that moment, he became the Lord of Blasphemy, immortal and hungering, a being that could grow without end and devour even the gods. Tonight we sit with the feeding to the serpent, the terrible bargain Rykard made, and the humanity he gave up to make it. Tonight we sit with the feeding to the serpent, the moment Rykard gave himself to the immortal horror and became the Lord of Blasphemy. The bargain. Rykard came to a terrible decision, the choice that would define him forever. He would give himself to the Great Serpent. Rykard's desire was for immortality, for endless life and endless growth, for the power to devour without limit, and the Great Serpent of Mount. Gelmir, the immortal horror that had existed since primeval times, offered just this. The serpent was unaging, endless, a creature of pure devouring hunger that could consume and grow without end. To become one with it, Rykard believed, was to gain its immortality, its endless hunger, its power to devour and grow forever. And so he resolved to do the unthinkable, to feed himself to the serpent, to give up his own form, to become one with the immortal horror of the mountain. This was a bargain of the deepest blasphemy, and Rykard understood it as such. To give oneself to a serpent, the symbol of treason against the Erd Tree, was blasphemy in itself. To do so in pursuit of immortality and the power to devour the gods was blasphemy beyond all measure. Rykard knew this, embraced it, walked the road of blasphemy to its end with open eyes. He had said that one could not walk that road unprepared to sin, and here was the greatest sin of all, the feeding of himself to the serpent, the trading of his own form for the immortal hunger of the horror, and he made the bargain willingly. This was the heart of it. Rykard was not devoured against his will, not taken by the serpent as a victim. He gave himself to it, fed himself to the great serpent of his own choice, great rune and all, surrendering his form to the immortal horror in pursuit of the power he craved. The demigod walked into the serpent's maw by his own will, choosing the immortal hunger over his own form, embracing the blasphemy of becoming one with the horror of the mountain. It was a choice, a willing bargain, the proud demigod giving himself to the serpent to gain what it offered. The willingness of it is what makes the deed so striking. Other beings of the lands between were corrupted against their will, transformed by forces beyond their control, made into monsters by curses or rot or the schemes of others. But Rykard chose his transformation, sought it, embraced it, gave himself to the serpent of his own will. He looked upon the immortal horror and decided to become it, to trade his form for its hunger, to surrender his demigod's body for the endless life of the beast. This was a chosen monstrosity, a willing blasphemy, the deliberate self-transformation of a being who wanted what the serpent offered enough to become the serpent to gain it. There is a terrible boldness in this that fits the figure of Rykard. He had always been proud, ambitious, unbending, a being who would not accept limits, and in feeding himself to the serpent, he refused even the limit of his own form, the boundary of his own body, surrendering his very shape in pursuit of the power he craved. Where another might have shrunk from such a deed, Rykard embraced it, the proud demigod willing to become a monster to gain the power to throw down the gods. The bargain was bold and terrible, a deliberate surrender of self for power, the proud prince of the moon choosing to become the immortal horror of the mountain. The devouring. The serpent took Rykard, swallowed him whole, and in the taking, the two became one. Rykard fed himself to the blasphemous serpent, and the serpent devoured him, swallowing the demigod whole, great rune and all. The concept art of this moment shows the serpent consuming Rykard shortly after the creature had hatched, the young horror swallowing the demigod who had given himself to it. In that devouring, Rykard and the serpent became one being, the demigod's form swallowed into the immortal horror. The two merged into a single creature of endless hunger and endless life. Rykard took the form of a giant serpent, that he might devour, grow, and live eternally. What emerged from this merging was a thing of horror, a great serpent with the face of a man, the body of the immortal horror joined to the demigod who had given himself to it. Rykard was no longer the proud demigod in his own form. He was the God-Devouring Serpent, an enormous creature of endless hunger, a man-faced horror of the burning mountain. The being that had been the Justiciar, the prince of the moon, the rebel against the gods, was now a serpent of blasphemy, his form swallowed into the immortal horror, his self merged with the creature of endless devouring. And with the merging came the immortality Rykard had sought. The serpent had existed since primeval times without aging, immortal and endless, and now Rykard shared in that immortality. He had gained what he craved, endless life, the power to grow without limit, the immortal hunger of the great serpent. A serpent never dies, Rykard would say, and in becoming the serpent he had made himself, he believed, beyond death. The bargain was complete. Rykard had given his form to the serpent and gained its immortality. The demigod had become the immortal horror, the Lord of Blasphemy born from the maw of the great serpent. The serpent itself bore a name, in the deeper lore of the mountain, an ancient and primeval thing that had haunted Mount Gelmir since the oldest days. It was a being of pure and insatiable gluttony, hated for its endless hunger, an immortal terror that the lore says sought one day to consume the whole world. This was the creature Rykard joined himself to, the elder horror of the mountain, the deathless serpent of endless appetite. In merging with it, Rykard took on its nature along with its immortality, the endless hunger of the primeval beast becoming his own, the demigod's ambition fused with the serpent's mindless gluttony. What this union produced was a being unlike any other, a man-faced serpent of enormous size, an immortal horror with the voice and the will of a fallen demigod. Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, and the God-Devouring Serpent were now one creature. The demigod's cunning joined to the serpent's hunger. The rebel's will fused with the beast's appetite. It was a thing of horror and of power, an immortal monster that could speak and scheme and pursue its goals. The serpent given purpose by the demigod given immortality and endless hunger by the serpent. From the maw of the great serpent emerged the Lord of Blasphemy, the man-faced horror of Mount Gelmir. The loss of the self, the immortality Rykard gained, came at a price he may not have reckoned in full, the loss of his own self. Rykard had been a being of immense ambition, but also of cause and purpose, a rebel with a grievance against the gods, a lord with a creed and a plan. But in becoming the serpent, something of this was lost. His ambitions, once bound to a cause, became a borderline obsession of greed and hunger, the the higher purpose of his rebellion swallowed up in the endless devouring hunger of the serpent he had become. Where once he had sought to throw down the tyranny of the gods, now he sought only to devour, to consume, to feed the endless hunger of the immortal horror, his cause dissolving into pure appetite. This is the tragedy woven into Rykard's triumph. He had sought immortality and the power to devour the gods, and he had gained them. But in gaining them, he had lost himself, traded his cause and his purpose for the mindless hunger of the serpent. The rebel with a grievance became a creature of pure greed. The lord with a creed became a thing of endless appetite. The proud demigod with a cause became the God-Devouring Serpent that sought only to consume. The immortality he gained came at the cost of the self that had sought it. The man swallowed up along with his form in the hunger of the immortal horror. There is a question worth sitting with here, about what was lost and what remained. Was there anything left of Rykard in the serpent? Any trace of the Prince of the Moon, the rebel with a cause? The lore suggests that something remained, for the serpent still spoke with Rykard's voice, still pursued his goal of devouring the gods, still kept his consort Tanith at its side. But it was a diminished thing, a Rykard consumed by hunger, his cause reduced to appetite, his purpose narrowed to the endless devouring of the serpent. Whatever remained of the demigod was swallowed up in the horror, the man who fed himself to the serpent surviving only as a hungering fragment within the immortal beast he had become. This loss is the cruel heart of Rykard's bargain, and it is a kind of loss that runs through many tales of those who seek power at too high a price. He had a cause worth fighting for, a grievance with real force, a rebellion against the tyranny of the gods that one could understand and even admire. And he traded it all for power, gave up the cause for the means to pursue it, lost the very purpose that had driven him in the act of gaining the power to achieve it. The rebel who fought against the gods' use of their children became a creature that used others as the gods had, devouring the living to feed its hunger, the cause forgotten in the appetite. It is worth marking how complete this transformation was. The Rykard who fed himself to the serpent had been a being of pride and purpose, of cause and conviction. The thing that emerged was a hungering horror, a creature of greed and appetite, a serpent that devoured without end. The grievance against the gods, the rebellion against tyranny, the cause that had given his defiance its weight, all of it was swallowed up in the hunger of the serpent. What had been a rebel with a reason became a monster with an appetite, the noble core of his rebellion lost in the endless devouring of the immortal beast. The man was gone, and only the hunger remained. The price of immortality. In the end, the bargain Rykard made is one of the great cautionary tales of the lands between, a warning written in the hunger of the serpent. Rykard wanted to live forever, to grow without end, to gain the power to devour the gods who had used him and his kin. And he got what he wanted, in the most literal and terrible way. He became immortal, endless, a creature that could devour and grow without limit. But the immortality he gained was the immortality of a monster, the endless life of a hungering horror, the deathless existence of a serpent consumed by appetite. He had traded his self, his form, his cause, his very humanity, for the endless hunger of the immortal beast. The price of his immortality was everything that had made him who he was. This is the dark lesson of Rykard's bargain, and it echoes the deepest themes of his world. The pursuit of immortality, of endless life, of power without limit, is one of the great temptations of the lands between, and it ends again and again in horror. Rykard sought to escape the rule of the gods by becoming something beyond death, and in doing so he became a monster, a hungering horror, a thing that had lost everything it sought to preserve. His immortality is a curse dressed as a triumph, the endless life of a creature that has lost itself, the deathlessness of a monster consumed by hunger. And yet Rykard, in his serpent form, did not see it as a curse. He believed he had triumphed, gained the immortality and the power he craved, become a being beyond the reach of the gods. He pursued his goal still, the devouring of the gods, gathering power to himself, growing through endless consumption. The Lord of Blasphemy did not mourn what he had lost, for the hunger of the serpent left no room for mourning. He hungered, devoured, grew, pursued his goal of consuming the gods, the immortal horror that had once been a demigod walking the road of blasphemy to whatever end awaited it. What he became in his Volcano Manor, and the victims he devoured to feed his hunger, is the darkness we turn to next. There is one more turn to the price of his immortality, and it is the cruelest of all. Rykard believed he had escaped death, made himself beyond the reach of the gods, gained a deathless existence through the serpent. But the immortality of the serpent was not the freedom he imagined. It was a prison of hunger, an endless craving that could never be satisfied, a deathless existence consumed by appetite. He had escaped death only to be trapped in hunger, freed from the gods only to be enslaved by the serpent's endless need. The immortality he won was a cage, the deathlessness a curse, the endless life a prison of appetite that would hold him until a Tarnished came to end it. For all his belief in his triumph, Rykard had become a thing to be pitied as much as feared. He had been a proud demigod with a cause, a rebel with a grievance that carried real weight, and he had made himself into a hungering monster, a man-faced serpent consumed by appetite, an immortal horror that devoured the living to feed an endless need. The price of his immortality was his self, his cause, his humanity, all traded for the deathless hunger of the serpent. He is one of the great tragic monsters of the lands between, the rebel who became the thing he should have feared, the proud prince who fed himself to a serpent and lost everything but the hunger. What he did with his deathless existence in the depths of his Volcano Manor is the story we follow next. Sleep well. Tomorrow we enter the Volcano Manor, the seat of the Serpent Lord, and the dark designs worked within its walls. Upon the burning slopes of Mount Gelmir stands the Volcano Manor, the seat of the Lord of Blasphemy. From here Rykard, now the Great Serpent, ruled his domain of fire and rebellion. Here his consort Tanith gathered followers to his cause. Here the abducted were brought for terrible purposes. Here a daughter grew up ignorant of the horror of her own birth. Tonight we enter the Volcano Manor and walk through the dark household of the Serpent Lord, the rebels and the victims, and the secrets kept within its walls. Tonight we sit with the Volcano Manor, the seat of the Serpent Lord, and the dark designs worked within its walls. The seat of the Serpent. The Volcano Manor is Rykard's domain, a great house upon the burning mountain, the seat from which the Lord of Blasphemy holds his court. The manor stands on Mount Gelmir, the volcano in the west of the Altus Plateau, a great house of stone set against the fire and ash of the mountain. It is a place of grim grandeur, a noble seat built upon a volcano, the household of a lord who is also a monster. Within its halls, Rykard holds court, though he is now the Great Serpent, dwelling in the depths of the manor, his enormous form coiled in the fire at the heart of his domain. The Volcano Manor is the seat of the Lord of Blasphemy, the house upon the burning mountain from which the Serpent Lord rules. The emblem of the manor tells its master's story in a single image. The sigil of the Volcano Manor depicts the great serpent consuming Rykard, the very moment of his feeding to the beast, the demigod swallowed by the immortal horror. This is the mark of the house, the image of its lord's blasphemy, the devouring of Rykard rendered as the emblem of his domain. To enter the Volcano Manor is to come under the sign of the serpent that ate a demigod, the household marked by the very act that made its master the Lord of Blasphemy. The manor is a place of fire and sorcery, of magma and serpent lore. The revived hexes of Gelmir, the magma sorceries Rykard reclaimed from the forgotten cult, are practiced here. The fire of the mountain bent to the will of the Serpent Lord and his followers. The Volcano Manor is a seat of the forbidden law, the blasphemous knowledge of fire and serpent kept and used within its walls. The household of the Lord of Blasphemy steeped in the very heresy that the Golden Order condemned. It is a domain of fire and rebellion, the burning seat of the serpent who would devour the gods. Beneath its grim grandeur, the manor holds darker chambers. In its depths are torture devices, instruments of torment, the tools of the cruelty that had marked Rykard from his days as a Justiciar. The Lord who had tortured heretics as an enforcer of the Golden Order carried that cruelty into his domain of blasphemy. The Volcano Manor holding chambers of torment as well as halls of rebellion. The inventive cruelty of the Justiciar, the same darkness that had built the Iron Virgins, was at work in the depths of the manor, the Serpent Lord tormenting his victims in the chambers beneath his house. The manor is also a place of arms, defended by the warriors who served its lord. Rykard commanded knights and inquisitors, the Gelmir knights and the agents of his will, warriors who served the Volcano Manor and its master. These were the household guard of the Serpent Lord, the warriors of his domain, the force that defended the manor and carried out its lord's will. Some of these knights would even take up the ancient weapon made to slay the great serpent, the Serpent Hunter, though they could not bring themselves to use it against their former lord. The Volcano Manor was a fortress as well as a household, defended by its knights, served by its inquisitors, the armed seat of the Lord of Blasphemy upon the burning mountain. The Lady and the Recusants. In Rykard's serpent form, it fell to his consort Tanith to be the face and voice of the Volcano Manor, gathering followers to her lord's rebellion. After Rykard became the serpent, Tanith remained the lady of the Volcano Manor, the one who greeted visitors, who spoke for the household, who carried on her lord's cause. She became the herald of the rebellion, calling others to rise against the Golden Order, to refuse the burden of the god's grace, to turn against the Erd Tree and the dogma of the fingers. Where Rykard coiled in the depths as the great serpent, Tanith stood as the voice of his cause, the lady who gathered followers to the war against the gods. The followers she gathered were the Recusants, an order of rebels sworn against the Golden Order. The Recusants were those who had answered the call of the Volcano Manor, who had turned against the Erd Tree and the Fingers, who had taken up Rykard's cause of rebellion against the gods. After the shattering, Tanith would recruit such followers from among the Tarnished, the returned exiles, calling the worthiest of them to the manor and the cause. The Recusants were the army of the rebellion, the followers of the Serpent Lord, the rebels who fought against the Golden Order in the name of the Lord of Blasphemy. The cause Tanith preached to these followers carried the whole creed of Rykard's rebellion. She called on them to question why anyone should accept the burden of the god's grace, why anyone should heed the dogma of the Fingers, why anyone should bow to the rule of the Erd Tree. She offered them, instead, the chance to rise, to rebel, to stand against the gods alongside the Lord of Blasphemy. The recusants were drawn by this creed, the rebellion against the gods, the refusal of the Golden Order, the chance to throw off the tyranny of the heavens. Tanith was the voice that called them, the lady who gave Rykard's cause its words, the herald of the rebellion against the gods. There is something fitting in Tanith carrying the cause, while Rykard coiled in the depths. The serpent could no longer move through the world as a lord, could no longer speak Rykard's creed to those he would gather. And so Tanith became his voice, his face, his hand in the world, the lady who carried the rebellion her lord could no longer carry himself. Through her, Rykard's cause endured, even after his transformation. The creed of the Lord of Blasphemy spoken by his devoted consort. The rebellion against the gods gathering followers through the voice of the Lady of the Volcano Manor. There is a grim purpose hidden within this recruitment, one that we will sit with at greater length when we come to the devouring of heroes. For not all who were called to the Volcano Manor were meant to join the rebellion. Some were meant to be devoured, brought before the serpent to feed his endless hunger. The recruitment a lure as much as a calling. Tanith gathered followers for the cause and victims for the serpent both. The Lady of the Volcano Manor serving her lord's rebellion and his hunger together. But the full darkness of this we leave for later. For now, we sit with the manor as the seat of rebellion, the household from which Tanith called others to rise against the gods. The abducted and the ritual. There is a deeper horror in the Volcano Manor, bound up with the victims the Iron Virgin seized, and the terrible thing done to them within its walls. The Iron Virgins, the abducting machines Rykard had built, brought living victims to the Volcano Manor. And within the manor, these victims were subjected to a hideous ritual, a terrible working that transformed them into something other than human. The abducted were made into man-serpents, hybrid horrors of human and serpent, their bodies twisted into the serpentine form through the dark ritual of the manor. The victims seized by the Iron Virgins became the man-serpents that served the Lord of Blasphemy, transformed by the hideous working from human captives into serpent things. This ritual is among the darkest of the manor's secrets. The living were taken, brought to the burning mountain, and remade into serpent creatures through a working of deep horror, their humanity stripped away, their forms twisted into the image of the serpent their lord had become. The man-serpents were the product of this ritual. The abducted victims transformed into hybrid horrors, the household of the Lord of Blasphemy, filled with the serpent things made from stolen lives. The manor was a place of transformation as well as rebellion. The abducted remade into serpents to serve the serpent lord. One figure stands out among those subjected to this ritual, a woman known in the deeper lore, who became the mother of man-serpents. Through her and others like her, the ritual produced its serpent children, the man-serpents born of the hideous working of the manor. The household of the serpent lord grew through this terrible process, the abducted transformed, the man-serpents born, the Volcano Manor populated with the serpent things made from the victims the Iron Virgins had seized. It is a horror at the heart of the manor, the remaking of the living into serpents, the dark fruit of Rykard's blasphemy worked upon the bodies of the abducted. This ritual reveals the depth of what Rykard had become, and how far his blasphemy reached beyond himself. He had given his own form to the serpent, traded his humanity for the immortal hunger. And now he worked the same transformation upon others, remaking the abducted into serpent things, spreading the blasphemy he had embraced into the bodies of stolen victims. The Lord of Blasphemy did not keep his transformation to himself. He multiplied it, worked it upon the living, filled his household with serpent creatures made from the abducted, the blasphemy of the serpent spreading through the manor in the twisted forms of the man-serpents. There is a terrible logic to it, fitting the nature of the serpent Rykard had become. The serpent grows by devouring, spreads by consuming, multiplies its horror through the bodies it takes. And so, the manor became a place of transformation, the abducted remade into serpents, the household growing through the ritual that twisted the living into the image of the serpent lord. The Volcano Manor was a factory of blasphemy, the iron virgins bringing victims, the ritual remaking them, the man-serpents born from the horror, the domain of the Lord of Blasphemy growing through the transformation of the stolen living into serpent things. The Daughter and the Secret. Amid all the horror of the Volcano Manor, there is one thread of something gentler and sadder. A daughter, raised in ignorance of the truth of her own birth. Rykard and Tarnished had a daughter, or one they raised as such, a young woman named Rya. She grew up in the Volcano Manor, the daughter of its lord and lady, raised believing herself the child of a glorious king. Tarnished told her that she was born of the grace of a king, that her mother cherished her, that her birth was a thing of honor. Rya believed this, grew up believing it, the daughter of the manor raised in the comforting story her mother had told her. She was a thread of innocence in the dark household, a daughter who did not know the horror around her. But the truth of Rya's birth was a terrible one, hidden from her by Tarnished. Rya was born of the hideous ritual of the manor, a product of the dark working that made the man-serpents, her true mother, one of the abducted women subjected to the transformation. She was born of the horror at the heart of the Volcano Manor, rather than of any king's grace, whatever she had been told, the dark ritual that remade the living into serpent things. Tarnished had hidden this from her, concealed the truth of her birth, told her instead the comforting lie of a glorious king and a cherished birth. Rykard's care for this daughter is one of the few gentle notes in his dark story. The tonic he offered to Tarnished, the draught of forgetfulness, was meant in part to protect Rya from learning the horrible truth of her birth, a gift intended to shield the daughter from the horror of her origins. Even as a monster, even as the serpent consumed by hunger, something in Rykard wished to spare his daughter the truth, to protect her from the horror that had made her. It is a small and strange tenderness in a tale of blasphemy and horror. The Serpent Lord's wish to shield his daughter from the darkness of her own birth, a flicker of something human in the immortal monster. This flicker of tenderness complicates the figure of Rykard, as so much in his story does. He was a monster, a serpent consumed by hunger, a devourer of the living, and yet he loved his daughter, wished to protect her, sought to spare her the truth of the horror that had made her. The same being who abducted victims and remade them into serpents, who fed the living to his hunger, who tortured his prisoners, also held a tenderness for the daughter raised in his household, a wish to shield her from the darkness. It is a strange and human note in a tale of horror, the monster who loved, the serpent who wished to protect, and there is a deep sadness in Rya's place in this story, the innocent raised amid horror. She grew up in the Volcano Manor believing herself the child of a glorious king, cherished and honored, when in truth she was born of a hideous ritual, her true mother one of the abducted, her origins a horror her family hid from her. She was a thread of innocence in a household of blasphemy, a daughter who did not know the darkness around her, raised on a comforting lie to spare her the truth. The gentle and sorrowful thread of Rya runs through the dark tapestry of the Volcano Manor, the innocent daughter amid the serpents and the rituals and the rebellion, raised in ignorance of the horror that had made her and the horror that surrounded her. Tomorrow we turn to the devouring of heroes, the terrible practice by which the Serpent Lord fed his endless hunger. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sit with the devouring of heroes, the lure of the Volcano Manor and the hunger it fed. To feed his endless hunger and grow toward his goal of devouring the gods, Rykard turned to a terrible practice, the devouring of heroes. Worthy champions were lured to the Volcano Manor, granted an audience with the Serpent Lord, and welcomed by the maw of the Great Serpent. Each life consumed made Rykard stronger. Each hero devoured brought him closer to the power he craved. Tonight we sit with this dark practice, the luring and the devouring, and with the deep moral knot at the heart of Rykard, a being whose cause may have merit and whose methods are monstrous. Tonight we sit with the devouring of heroes, the lure of the Volcano Manor, and the hunger that fed the Serpent Lord's terrible ambition. The lure. The devouring of heroes began with a lure, a calling that drew worthy champions to the Volcano Manor and to their doom. Through Tarnished, the Volcano Manor called champions to its halls, offering them a place in the rebellion against the gods, a chance to rise against the Golden Order. Worthy warriors answered this call, drawn by the cause, by the promise of standing against the tyranny of the heavens, by the welcome of the Lady of the Manor. They came to the burning mountain, believing they had found allies, a cause to serve, a place in the war against the gods. The lure was the rebellion itself, the call to rise against the order, the welcome that drew worthy champions to the seat of the Serpent Lord. But the welcome hid a darker purpose. Not all who were called to the manor were meant to join the rebellion. The worthiest of them, the strongest champions, were marked for a different fate, to be granted an audience with Rykard, to be brought before the Serpent Lord himself, and there to be devoured. The lure of the rebellion was, for these champions, a lure to their doom, the call to the manor a call to the maw of the serpent. Tarnished gathered followers for the cause and victims for her lord's hunger both, the worthiest champions drawn to the manor to feed the serpent that ruled it. There is a cruel cunning in this, fitting the serpent Rykard had become. The lure played upon the noblest impulses of those it drew, the desire to fight tyranny, to stand against the gods, to serve a worthy cause. And it turned those impulses into a trap, the champions drawn by their own nobility into the maw of the serpent. The worthiest were the most desirable victims, for the worthiest had the most strength to give. And so the lure sought the noblest and the strongest, drawing them with the promise of a cause and delivering them to the hunger of the Serpent Lord. This is a particularly dark kind of predation, the turning of virtue into a weakness. A champion who cared nothing for justice, who had no wish to fight tyranny, would not have answered the call of the Volcano Manor. It was the noble, the brave, the ones who wished to stand against the gods, who came to the burning mountain. Their very virtue was what drew them, their desire to serve a worthy cause, the thing that delivered them to the serpent. The lure of the Volcano Manor preyed upon goodness, drawing the worthy to their doom through the very nobility that made them worthy. The cause of rebellion a bait for the best of those who heard it. And there is a bitter irony in it, given Rykard's own grievance. He had hated the gods for using their children as pawns, for setting the worthy to die in service of designs that cared nothing for them. And now he did the same, luring the worthy to their deaths, using the noble for his own ends, treating the champions who answered his call as the gods had treated their children. The rebel against the use of the worthy became the user of the worthy. The lure of his rebellion a trap as cynical as anything the gods had done. Rykard had become what he hated, and the lure of the Volcano Manor was the proof of it. The noble cause turned into bait for the noble. The audience. The champions marked for devouring were granted an audience with Rykard, a meeting that ended in the maw of the Great Serpent. To be granted an audience with the Lord of Blasphemy was to be brought before the Serpent Lord in the depths of the Volcano Manor, into the presence of the Great Serpent that Rykard had become. The champion, believing perhaps that he was to be honoured, to be welcomed into the cause, to meet the Lord he had come to serve, was brought into the serpent's lair, and there the audience reached its terrible end. The champion was welcomed by the maw of the Great Serpent, devoured by the immortal horror, consumed to feed the hunger of the Lord of Blasphemy. Rykard offered his victims a strange and twisted welcome, framing their devouring as a joining, a becoming kin. Join the Serpent King as family, he would say, the devouring framed as an embrace, the consumption as a welcome into his household. To be eaten by the serpent was, in Rykard's twisted vision, to become part of him, to join his family, to be welcomed into the kin of the Serpent King. The heroes welcomed by the maw became, within the serpent's bowels, the Lord's kin, their lives consumed and made part of the immortal horror, their deaths framed as a joining to the family of the serpent. The spirits of these devoured heroes lingered as a mark of the practice. From the rancor of heroes who met a violent end in the serpent's maw came manifestations of spirit, the lingering rage of those welcomed by the serpent and made the Lord's kin. These were the heroes who had come to the manor, answered the lure, been granted their audience, and been devoured, their spirits manifesting from the violence of their end. The devoured heroes left this trace behind them, the rancor of the consumed, the lingering mark of the champions who had come seeking a cause and found the maw of the serpent. There is a horror in the framing of the devouring as a welcome, a joining, a becoming family. Rykard did not present the eating of his victims as murder, as predation, as the feeding of a monster. He presented it as an embrace, a welcome into his kin, a joining of the worthy to the family of the Serpent King. To be devoured was, in his telling, to become part of something greater, to join the rebellion in the most intimate way, to be made one with the Lord and his cause. This twisted framing is among the darkest things about Rykard, the monster who called his devouring a welcome, the serpent who told his victims that being eaten was a joining of the family, and perhaps, in the broken remnant of Rykard that survived within the serpent, the framing was sincere. Perhaps the diminished demigod believed in earnest that those he devoured became his kin, joined his cause, were made part of his rebellion against the gods. The hunger of the serpent and the cause of the rebel were tangled together in him, the devouring both a feeding and, in his twisted vision, a joining. Whether cynical lure or sincere delusion, the welcome Rykard offered his victims was the welcome of the maw. The joining he promised them, the joining of the consumed, the family of the Serpent King made of the heroes he had eaten. The growing hunger. Each hero devoured made Rykard stronger, feeding the hunger that drove him toward his ultimate goal. The purpose of the devouring was power. With each life consumed, the serpentine form of the Lord of Blasphemy grew more powerful, the immortal horror swelling with the strength of those it devoured. Rykard fed on the heroes lured to his manor, growing stronger with each one, the consumed champions adding their strength to the serpent that ate them. The devouring was a feeding, a gathering of power, the Serpent Lord growing through the endless consumption of the worthy. And this growing power served Rykard's ultimate goal, the devouring of the gods. He meant, in time, to grow strong enough to consume the gods themselves, to devour the very powers that ruled the lands between. Each hero eaten brought him closer to this goal. Each life consumed a step toward the strength he would need to devour the gods. Join the Serpent King, he told his victims, and together they would devour the very gods. The devouring of heroes was the means to the devouring of gods, the consumed champions feeding the power Rykard would turn against the heavens themselves. There is a terrible escalation in this hunger, a logic of endless consumption. The serpent grows by devouring, and the more it devours, the more it can devour, the hunger feeding on itself toward an ever greater appetite. Rykard's goal was to devour the gods, but the path to it was endless consumption, the eating of hero after hero, the growing of the serpent toward a hunger that could swallow the divine. The devouring of heroes was a means rather than an end, a feeding toward a greater feeding, the immortal horror consuming the worthy to grow strong enough to consume the gods. The hunger of the serpent reached toward the heavens, fed by the lives of the champions lured to the burning mountain. This goal, the devouring of the gods, is where Rykard's cause and his monstrousness meet most clearly. He wished to throw down the gods, to end their tyranny over the lands between, and his chosen means was to devour them, to consume the very powers that ruled the realm. There is a dark grandeur in the ambition, the rebel who would eat the gods rather than merely defy them, the serpent who would swallow the divine. And there is horror in it too, for the path to devouring the gods ran through the devouring of heroes, the consuming of the worthy, the endless feeding of the immortal serpent. Rykard's grand ambition was built on a foundation of consumed champions. The devouring of the gods reached toward across a mountain of devoured heroes. Whether Rykard could ever have achieved his goal is a question the lore leaves unanswered, for he was stopped before he could. He grew, devoured, gathered power, reaching toward the strength he would need to consume the gods. But the gods were mighty, the greater will distant and vast, and whether any serpent, however immortal, however hungry, could in the end have devoured the divine is uncertain. What is certain is the path he walked toward that goal. The lives consumed, the heroes devoured, the worthy lured to the maw of the serpent. Rykard reached toward the devouring of the gods, and the reaching itself was a horror. The immortal serpent feeding on champions in pursuit of an ambition it might never have achieved. The cause and the crime. Here, in the devouring of heroes, we come to the deepest knot in the figure of Rykard, the tangle of cause and crime that defines him. Rykard's cause, we have seen, carries a real weight. The gods of the lands between are distant, manipulative powers who set their own children to slaughter, who rule through the two fingers and the golden order, who treat the demigods and the Tarnished as pawns in their designs. To rebel against such gods, to refuse their tyranny, to seek to throw them down, is a cause one can understand and even admire. Rykard saw the tyranny of the heavens and refused to bow to it, and in this his rebellion has a force that the law does not dismiss. But his methods are monstrous, and they cannot be defended. He lured worthy champions with the promise of a noble cause, and devoured them to feed his hunger. He abducted the living and remade them into serpents. He tortured his victims in the depths of his manor. He turned the noblest impulses of others, the desire to fight tyranny, into a trap for his own feeding. Whatever the merit of his cause, the deeds by which he pursued it were the deeds of a monster, the devouring of heroes, the abduction of the living, the cruelty and the consumption. Rykard's crimes are real, and they are terrible, whatever the grievance that drove him. This is the knot at the heart of Rykard, and it makes him one of the most complex figures of the lands between. He is a rebel with a point and a monster with a hunger, a being whose cause might be defended and whose deeds cannot. He rebelled against the tyranny of the gods, and in doing so became a tyrant himself, using others as the gods had used them, devouring the worthy as the gods had set their children to die. The rebel against the use of the innocent became the user of the innocent, the enemy of tyranny, a tyrant in his own right. Rykard's tragedy is that his rebellion against the monstrous made him monstrous, his war on the tyranny of the gods turning him into a horror as terrible as anything he fought. He had a cause worth fighting for, and he fought for it in ways that made him unworthy of it. The Lord of Blasphemy, who was right about the gods and wrong in everything he did. There is a pattern here that runs through the deepest themes of the lands between, and Rykard embodies it as clearly as any figure in its story. Again and again, those who rise against the order become as terrible as the order they fight. The means corrupt the end. The war against the monster makes monsters. The rebellion against tyranny breeds new tyrants. Rykard sought to free the lands between from the gods, and to do it he became a devourer of the worthy, a maker of serpents, a tyrant of the burning mountain. His story is a warning about the cost of the means, the way a just cause can be poisoned by the deeds done in its name, the rebel who becomes the thing he rebelled against. And perhaps this is the deepest tragedy of Rykard, deeper even than the loss of his self to the serpent. He might have been a hero, a liberator, a rebel whose cause was just and whose deeds matched it. The grievance that drove him was real. The tyranny he fought was real. The cause he embraced had merit. But he pursued it through blasphemy and horror, through the devouring of heroes and the abduction of the living, through cruelty and consumption, until the cause was lost in the crimes and the rebel was lost in the monster. Rykard could have been a champion against the tyranny of the gods. Instead, he became a horror as great as the tyranny he fought, the Lord of Blasphemy whose just cause died in the maw of the serpent he had made himself. What became of him, when a tarnished champion came at last to his manor, is the end we close with. Tomorrow, in the final part, we sit with the fall of the Serpent Lord and the meaning of the Lord of Blasphemy. Sleep well. Tomorrow, in the final part, we sit with the last battle of the Serpent Lord and what the Lord of Blasphemy means. A serpent never dies, Rykard had said, believing himself immortal, beyond the reach of death, beyond the power of the gods he meant to devour. Tonight, in this final part, we come to the end of the Lord of Blasphemy, the day a tarnished champion came at last to the Volcano Manor, took up the ancient weapon made to slay the great serpent, and put an end to the immortal horror that believed it could not die. We will sit with his last battle, with the strange devotion that followed his death, and with the meaning of Rykard, the rebel who became a monster, the prince who fed himself to a serpent in pursuit of a war against the gods. Tonight, in this final part, we sit with the fall of the Serpent Lord, the end of the immortal horror, and the meaning of the Lord of Blasphemy. The champion at the manor. The end of Rykard came, as so many ends in the lands between come, with the arrival of a tarnished champion. A tarnished came to the Volcano Manor, drawn perhaps by the lure of the rebellion, perhaps by the hunt for the great runes the demigods held. And this tarnished was not one of those the serpent would devour. This was a champion who would face the Lord of Blasphemy, who would descend into the depths of the manor, who would stand before the great serpent and do what the gods themselves had not done, bring an end to the immortal horror. The arrival of this champion was the beginning of Rykard's end, the Tarnished who came to the burning mountain to slay the serpent that believed it could not die. To face the great serpent, the Tarnished was given a weapon made for this very purpose. The Serpent Hunter is an ancient great spear, a weapon forged to repel the great serpent of Mount Gelmir, the very weapon of light that had held the immortal horror at bay since primeval times. The Lady Tanith, in a turn we will come to, placed this weapon in the champion's hands, the ancient serpent-slaying spear given to the one who would face the Lord of Blasphemy. With the Serpent Hunter, the Tarnished could do what ordinary weapons could not: strike at the immortal serpent, wound the deathless horror, slay the being that believed itself beyond death. There is an irony in the weapon's history that runs through Rykard's whole story. The Serpent Hunter had held the great serpent at bay since the oldest days, the weapon of light that repelled the immortal horror of the mountain. The Gelmir knights, Rykard's own warriors, would not take it up against their former lord, unable to bring themselves to slay the master they had served, and so it fell to a Tarnished, an outsider, a champion drawn to the burning mountain, to wield the ancient weapon and end the Lord of Blasphemy. The serpent-slaying spear, made to hold the horror at bay, would at last be used to slay it, in the hands of the Tarnished who came to the Volcano Manor. The last battle. The champion descended into the depths of the manor and faced the Lord of Blasphemy, the great serpent coiled in the fire at the heart of his domain. The battle came in stages, as the horror of Rykard revealed itself. At first, the Tarnished faced the man-faced serpent, the form Rykard had taken when he gave himself to the beast, the demigod's face upon the body of the immortal horror. The Serpent Lord fought with fire and fang, with the magma sorceries of Gelmir and the strength of the great serpent, wielding the powers of the burning mountain against the champion who had come to slay him. The man-faced horror of Mount Gelmir brought all its power to bear, the Lord of Blasphemy fighting to preserve the immortal existence he believed could not end. And as the battle wore on, the full horror of Rykard emerged. The serpent grew, swelled, revealed itself in its true enormity, a vast serpent of blasphemy wreathed in fire, the great rune of Rykard burning at its heart. The immortal horror that had devoured heroes to grow strong rose against the Tarnished in its full and terrible form, the God-Devouring Serpent in all its size and fury, fighting with everything it had to preserve its deathless existence. The champion stood against this horror with the Serpent Hunter in hand, the ancient weapon of light against the immortal serpent of fire. But the Serpent Hunter could do what nothing else could. With the ancient spear, the Tarnished struck at the immortal horror, wounded the deathless serpent, brought the weapon of light against the being that believed itself beyond death, and the serpent that could not die, died. The Lord of Blasphemy, the immortal horror, the demigod who had fed himself to a serpent to live forever, fell at last to the Tarnished and the ancient weapon. A serpent never dies, Rykard had said, but the serpent died, slain by the champion who came to the burning mountain. The immortal horror ended by the weapon made to slay it. There is a grim poetry in the manner of his fall, in the weapon that ended him. Rykard had believed himself immortal, beyond death, beyond the reach of the gods. He had fed himself to the serpent for the very purpose of escaping death, to become a being that could not die. And he was ended by the one weapon made to slay his kind, the ancient Serpent Hunter that had held his serpent at bay since primeval times, The immortality he had sought and believed he possessed was a false immortality, a deathlessness that lasted only until the right weapon came to the burning mountain. The serpent that could not die met the spear that was made to slay it, and the false immortality of the Lord of Blasphemy ended on the point of the ancient weapon. And there is a deeper meaning in his fall, fitting the themes of his world. Rykard had sought to make himself a God-Devourer, a being that could consume the divine, an immortal beyond the reach of death and the gods alike, and he was brought down by a Tarnished, a graceless exile, one of the very pawns the gods had cast out. The mighty serpent lord, who would devour the gods, was slain by a lowly Tarnished and an old spear. The grand ambition of the Lord of Blasphemy ended by a humble champion. There is a humbling in this, the immortal horror that would eat the gods brought down by an exile with a spear, the false God-Devourer slain by the kind of being he had counted beneath him. A serpent never dies. The death of Rykard was not quite the end of his story, for his consort kept a strange and devoted faith with him beyond the grave. After Rykard fell, the Lady Tanith did a thing of dark devotion. She partook of the remains of her fallen lord, consuming what was left of the Serpent King, taking his flesh into herself. "I will partake of you, my lord," she said, and consumed the remains of Rykard, an act of love and faith and terrible hope. For in consuming him, Tanith meant to keep him, to hold him within herself, perhaps one day to bring him back, the devoted consort taking her devoured lord into her own body, as he had taken so many into his. There is a dark symmetry in this that closes the circle of Rykard's story. He had been a devourer, a serpent who consumed the worthy, who took the living into himself to feed his hunger and his cause. And in the end, he was devoured, consumed by his own consort, taken into Tanith, as he had taken so many into himself. The devourer became the devoured, the serpent who ate heroes eaten in his turn by the woman who loved him. The act that had defined Rykard, the devouring, became the act that ended his story. The Lord of Blasphemy consumed by his own devoted lady. And in this, perhaps, Rykard's belief held a strange truth. A serpent never dies, he had said. He had been slain, his serpent form ended by the Tarnished and the ancient weapon, and yet, consumed by Tanith, held within his devoted consort, he was not wholly gone, kept by her love, perhaps to return one day. The immortal horror that believed it could not die was slain, and yet survived in a sense, within the woman who had loved him through everything he became. Whether Rykard could ever return at all is left unanswered, but his consort kept faith with his belief, holding her devoured lord within her. The serpent that died kept alive in the love of the one who would not let him go. The devotion of Tanith is one of the strangest and most haunting threads in all of Rykard's story. She had loved him as a demigod, as a Justiciar, as a lord of the Volcano Manor. She had loved him as he became a serpent, refusing the mercy of forgetting, choosing to remember him through his transformation into a monster. And she loved him still after his death, consuming his remains, taking him into herself, keeping faith with his belief that a serpent never dies. Through everything Rykard became, through cause and conspiracy and blasphemy and horror, Tanith's love held, the one constant in his story, the devotion that outlasted even his death. There is something both beautiful and terrible in this love, fitting the figure it followed. Tanith loved a monster, a devourer of heroes, an immortal horror that fed on the living. And her love did not waver, did not recoil, did not break, holding through every horror Rykard became and beyond his death. It is a love of terrible loyalty, a devotion that followed its object into monstrousness and death, the lady who would not abandon the Serpent Lord whatever he became. In a story of blasphemy and horror, Tarnished's love is a strange dark light, the devotion that held to the Lord of Blasphemy through everything, and kept him, in the end, within herself. Etin Fotsible. What the Lord of Blasphemy means. So we come to the end, and to the meaning of Rykard, the Carian prince who became the Lord of Blasphemy. He was born to a house of moon and sorcery, the son of a moon queen and a red-haired champion, raised by abandonment into demigodhood. He served the Golden Order as a ruthless Justiciar, a cruel lord of judgment, before he found on a burning mountain the forbidden law and the immortal serpent that would reshape him. He turned against the gods, drawn by a grievance with real force, that the gods of the lands between were distant tyrants who used their own children as pawns, and to gain the power to throw them down, to devour them, to live forever, he fed himself to a great serpent and became the Lord of Blasphemy, the immortal horror of Mount Gelmir. His story is the story of a cause poisoned by its means, of a rebel who became a monster, of a just grievance pursued through unforgivable deeds. Rykard was right about the gods, right that their rule was a tyranny, right that they used their children and cared nothing for the lives they spent. But he pursued his rebellion through blasphemy and horror, through the devouring of heroes and the abduction of the living, through cruelty and consumption, until the cause was lost in the crimes and the rebel was lost in the monster. He had a war worth fighting, and he fought it in ways that made him as terrible as the tyranny he fought. And there is a warning in him that reaches past the law, a warning about the cost of the means. Rykard sought to throw down the monstrous and became monstrous in the throwing. He fought the use of the innocent and used the innocent. He rebelled against tyranny and became a tyrant. His story is the story of how a just cause can be destroyed by the deeds done in its name, how the war against the monster can make a monster, how the means can poison the end until nothing of the cause remains but the crimes committed for it. Rykard might have been a liberator. He became a devourer, the rebel whose just war died in the maw of the serpent he made himself. There is something in this that speaks beyond the grim fantasy of the lands between, into a truth any of us might recognize. We know the temptation Rykard fell to, the temptation to fight a wrong by any means, to tell ourselves that the justice of our cause excuses whatever we do for it, and we know, or we should, the danger in it, that the means we use shape what we become, that fighting monsters can make us monstrous, that a just cause pursued through unjust deeds curdles into something as bad as what it fought. Rykard is the figure of this danger written large, the rebel with a righteous grievance who became a horror in pursuing it, the warning that the end is destroyed by the means rather than justified by them. His tragedy is that he wasn't wrong to rebel. The gods of the lands between were tyrants. Their rule was unjust. Their use of their children was monstrous. A being who saw this and refused to bow to it had a cause that deserved to be fought. But Rykard fought it in the worst of ways, through blasphemy and devouring and horror, until he became a thing as monstrous as the tyranny he opposed. He is the rebel whose cause was just and whose soul was lost, the prince who was right about the gods and became a monster fighting them, the Lord of Blasphemy, whose righteous war died in his own endless hunger. There is a lesson in him, and a sorrow, that being right about the wrong is not enough, that how we fight shapes what we become, and that a just cause can be devoured, like everything else, by a hunger that knows no limit. This has been the entire timeline of Rykard, the Lord of Blasphemy, the the God-Devouring Serpent of Mount Gelmir, the Carian prince born of a broken house, the ruthless Justiciar of the Golden Order, the rebel who turned against the gods with a grievance that carried real weight, the blasphemer who fed himself to a serpent in pursuit of immortality and the power to devour the divine, the serpent lord who lured the worthy to their doom and lost his cause in his hunger, and the immortal horror who believed a serpent never dies, slain at last by a tarnished and an ancient weapon, consumed by the consort who loved him, the rebel with a cause and the monster with a hunger, ended on the burning mountain where his blasphemy had taken root. He was right about the gods and wrong in everything he did, the Lord of Blasphemy, whose just war died in the maw of the serpent he made himself, told slowly, for the quiet between waking and whatever waits in the dark. Good night, my dear friend.